I came for the House of Blossoms. If you thugs mean to waylay me...
Madame Zhao Zhao awaits you at the house, sir. I'm to escort you personally, if you'll just follow me.
This strutting rooster is being led right to the hen house. I'll play the fox.
Welcome back to Game Spice. This is episode 3 of the Theology of Thief series. We're with Kristin today, who's going to cover a bit more of what we had gone over last time. Last time was a bit of a big lesson. There was a lot of foundation we had to get through, and hopefully this time we can actually get into some of the fun stuff and how it pertains to Thief. And Kristin, what would you like to say?
All right. For this week's episode, I'm going to slow down a little bit so that we have a chance to really absorb all of these major concepts that I've been putting forth the last 2 episodes. And I'm going to also give you some new examples of mythology and history recited by Jessica in her best storyteller voice. Yeah, we're just going to look at mythology and in history to illustrate how mimetic crisis is behind the founding of human culture and religions, and how human culture and religion is based on violence. So we'll spend some more time today just unpacking those. But first, I want to go over again the whole cycle of mimetic crisis, which is sometimes also called the single victim mechanism. And those who are interested in Christian ethics and philosophy, this would be what we would call Satan. This would be also known as the satanic mechanism. So pick your favorite word, whether it's the mimetic crisis, cycle of mimetic crisis, or the single victim mechanism, or the satanic loop. You pick whichever you like the best. But what the crisis is, basically, is an escalation of mimetic rivalries. And remember, a mimetic rivalry is when you see someone in the way of the object of your desire. Perhaps they have the object of your desire, which is why you desire it in the first place. So they are your rival, and as you are competing against this person that you see as in your way, they begin to see you as a rival, and this is where you get vendettas. This is where you get retribution crimes. It goes back and forth between 2 people or 2 groups competing against each other, an eye for an eye, that sort of thing. But as we know, violence is contagious. So it can spread like an epidemic, and when you do have this escalation of rivalries, sometimes the people that are nearest to the rivals get sucked into it, and so it just grows and grows and spreads until you have 2 factions or 2 clans or 2 tribes that are doing this back and forth, and from the outside looking in, they look just the same, but they think that they're vastly different. So as this snowballs, it can build to the point of a crisis, which a crisis basically, you can tell what a crisis is because you start to see a loss of differences. Basically, hierarchies flatten and collapse, classes collapse. You know,
equality isn't a bad thing. It's just when it gets to the point that people panic, I think.
It's when you basically have anarchy. Society or civilization as you know it is collapsing around you. It's every man for himself, essentially.
The structure is gone.
Yes. So, and sometimes you know, it's been called the war of all against all at this point. And we're seeing that in Thief. They are in the middle of a mimetic crisis. Mm-hmm. So once again, a lot of these subjects are being studied extensively by René Girard. These are the resources that you've been working off of. This is a field of study, a certain idea that is in popular. It's a theory of violence. It's more academic than popular in the United States, but in Europe it has become a popular theory. Okay. Basically, because it's the best theory anyone has for why violence is. But let me get back to that cycle of mimetic crisis. Imagine a wheel in your head, and in the wheel it starts at the rivals, and then as you follow the wheel down, it escalates, and then it escalates till you have that loss of differences, and then you get to where the crowd looks around for the cause of the contagion, which the contagion in this case is violence. And they single somebody out who they believe truly is the cause of all of this badness.
Particularly back in...
This is the BCs.
The BCs.
This is the BCs. Okay. So they single this victim out, and they transfer all of their feelings of hate, negativity, violence, anger, everything you can imagine on this single victim. And then what does the unanimous crowd do? They immolate the victim, stone them, lynch them, exile, drive them off a cliff, you name it. Depending on the tribe or the clan or the nation, whatever the geography of the land is, that's what they will do. If there's a lot of trees, the person will be lynched or will be crucified. If there's a lot of stones, the person is more likely to be stoned. The Aztecs used fire. So it just depends. Some tribes near a lake, you drive the person into the lake until they return to the sea, right? That sort of thing.
Makes sense.
And then if you follow the wheel back up, after that immolation of that victim or after that stoning of that victim, there is a massive feeling of peace that comes down upon the crowd as they are unified through this act in which they expelled.
They're not acting alone anymore. They're all
unified.
Together.
Mm-hmm. And it is that unified peace that they have that makes the crowd, that makes the tribe or the nation or the people see their victim as a god. That wasn't a person. That was a God in flesh that came here to save us and to unify us.
And so what you're kind of saying is, as a human being, you go through this horrible experience. You finally find the cause or whatever you believe was the cause. And that feeling of peace afterwards makes you think, oh, we did the right thing.
Yes.
Oh, this was meant to be.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, this was a test by the gods. This was actually
Apollo or Dionysus.
Right.
Or it was, last week we were looking at the Nahuatl, the Aztec gods. You name it in these creation myths, this is the cycle that you see over and over and over in these myths. So again, you have an escalation of rivalries. You have a flattening or a loss of differentiation as hierarchies and organization collapses, every man for himself. You have a scapegoat singled out. Then you have a unanimous crowd that attacks spontaneously in the beginning that victim who is then killed. Then you have a catharsis or a peace. Remember, catharsis means a cleansing afterwards. And then you have a veneration of the dead victim who is then deified and becomes that star or that sun or the moon or what have you in the sky, right? And this is the basis, according to this theory, this is the basis of all, not only religion, but really culture.
And when we start picking apart the pop culture of the decades and eons, mythology, it starts to become, the cycle becomes clearer.
And so I'm going to give us some examples to look at. But first, I want to bring up a few new pieces of our puzzle here. So you have this foundation. How can it possibly build a culture? Well, because it worked. This worked. And so every time this same group of people has a crisis in the future, they are going to reenact this process. And that's where you get ritual and religion, right? Because it worked. And then you end up with all these rules and prohibitions and laws, which might sound really strange to us because they all have to do with things being pure or impure, clean or unclean. But really, they're all about keeping mimetic crisis at bay. So even if they have a taboo or a right or a prohibition against, you have a prohibition against, eating that food or sleeping with that particular type of person, those were all about preventing rivalries. As strange as they sound to us modern minds, they were all about preventing rivalries because these primitive people, primitive as in early, not as in stupid,
Yeah.
These people, they didn't know quite what was happening, but they knew these things were what was causing rivalries because they could connect it. They could see, if you steal from somebody, we need a taboo about that because then it will cause this sort of rivalry to happen again. Or if you kill that person's daughter, then that person's going to seek retribution against you and probably go after your family member. So again, you have all these prohibitions and laws that come out of this basically primitive form of religion. And that, so culture, religion, it goes in hand to hand, and it's all based on this cycle. So Jessica's going to read an interesting little myth. It's very short, from the Dogrib Indians, who are an Indian group in North America, and we're going to just see if we could decode it.
A woman has intercourse with a dog and gives birth to 6 puppies. Her tribe banishes her, and she is forced to hunt for her own food. One day, as she returns from the bush, she discovers that the puppies are children, and that they shed their animal skins the moment she leaves the house. So she pretends to leave, and when her children are, as it were, undressed, she takes their skins away, forcing them to keep their human identity from now on.
So what do we have here in this interesting little creation myth? The myth that's a foundation for how their culture came to be. How in the world do we see this cycle in this myth? Well, you have to kind of break it apart. For one thing, the person being singled out has an earmark or stereotype of a victim. Well, she's a woman. Mm-hmm. That's one of them.
And accused of...
She's accused of bestiality, which is a really common accusation towards the victim in these cases by the accusers. Remember, these myths were written by the survivors. They were written by the persecutors, not by the victim. So she's accused of basically, being the cause of some sort of crisis, a breakdown in differences, as if she is sleeping with an animal, this is symbolic of that lack of differences. There is no difference at this point between men and animals. Okay? There's no difference. Men are acting like animals. You cannot tell the difference. There is a major crisis going on. So what do? They single out their victim, their scapegoat in this case, a woman, and they banish her to what? To go into the wilderness and have to fend for herself. So basically, this is going to assure her death because it's
hard to survive alone in the wilds.
Right. So then the story goes on, and it says that she discovers that her children were shedding their animal skins every time she would leave, and when she comes back, they returned to animals. So what does she do? She goes and she steals their skins from them, so they have to remain human. So here we have someone who was the cause of a crisis, but once she is banished, she brings order back into her civilization. They turn from animal to human.
And stay that way.
She is the poison and she is the cure. This is the same cycle that we see over and over again. But some of you skeptics out there might be thinking, well, this is ridiculous. Not all of these myths have death in them or banishment, or not all of these myths talk about breakdowns and crisis in this way. This sounds crazy. Well, does it? We have another myth to look at. But before we look at it, I want to talk a little bit about what I call the Disneyfication of mythology through time. And I coined that myself. That is not from René Girard, I know. Basically, I want to make the point that myths evolved through time, just like everything else. Okay, they're oral traditions being passed down, and later generations sometimes want to polish, or we would call it
edges.
Make it politically correct to their day, stories of their ancestors. So what did Disney do with the Grimm's fairy tales? Well, that's what these later generations did to their own civilization's myths. They whitewashed the ugly truth of human sacrifice to be more palatable to their newer audiences. So essentially, the later poets made politically correct versions of the ancient creation stories of their gods and cities. And speaking of politically correct versions of myths from before Christ, or before the Common Era, we have a Norse myth that's going to be our example. And that is the myth of the death of Balder. And let's have Jessica tell us this story, and then we'll pick it apart.
Right, the death of Balder is one of the primary Norse myths. Balder was one of the most beloved of all the gods. The son of Odin, the chief of the gods, and the benevolent sorceress goddess Frigg, Balder was a generous, joyful, and courageous character who gladdened the hearts of all who spent time with him. When, therefore, he began to have ominous dreams of some grave misfortune befalling him, the fearful gods appointed Odin to discover their meaning. Balder's father wasted no time in mounting his steed Sleipnir and riding to the underworld to consult a dead seeress whom he knew to be especially wise in such matters. When, in one of his countless disguises, he reached the cold and misty underworld, he found the halls arrayed in splendor, as if some magnificent feast were about to occur. Odin woke the seeress and questioned her concerning this festivity, and she responded that the guest of honor was to be none other than Balder. She merrily recounted how the god would meet his doom, stopping only when she realized, from the desperate nature of Odin's entreaties, who this disguised wanderer truly was. And indeed all that she prophesied would come to pass. Odin returned in sorrow to Asgard, the god's celestial stronghold, and told his comrades what he had been told. Frigg, yearning for any chance of saving her treasured son, however remote, went to everything in the cosmos and obtained oaths not to harm Balder. After these oaths were secured, the gods made a sport out of the situation. They threw sticks, rocks, and anything else on hand at Balder, and everyone laughed as these things bounced off and left the shining god unharmed. The wily and disloyal Loki sensed an opportunity for mischief. In disguise, he went to Frigg and asked her, "Did all things swear oaths to spare Balder from harm?" "Oh yes," the goddess replied, "everything except the mistletoe, but the mistletoe is so small and innocent a thing that I felt it superfluous to ask it for an oath. What harm could it do my son?" Immediately upon hearing this, Loki departed, located the mistletoe, and brought it to where the gods were playing their new favorite game. He approached the blind god Hodr and said, "You must feel quite left out, having to sit back here away from the merriment, not being given a chance to show Balder the honor of proving his invincibility." The blind god concurred. "Here," said Loki, handing him the shaft of mistletoe, "I will point your hand in the direction where Balder stands, and you throw this branch at him." So Hodr threw the mistletoe. It pierced the god straight through, and he fell down dead on the spot.
So if this myth sounds very weird, that's because it is. You have a fake game. Why do I say a fake game? Okay, you have a story where you have a ring of people encircling one person they've singled out, throwing objects at this person. And yet it's just a game and everyone's laughing and it's really funny, right?
Which is a little bit odd when you take into consideration that up until that point everyone was terrified he would die.
Exactly. So this is a myth that most likely has been revised by later generations. People who were discomfited of the bloodiness and the violence of the original origin story about their hero Balder, who was obviously a scapegoat or someone who was singled out by his community and killed in a unanimous collective violence by the crowd. So the story, what you really have, if you look at it, is a group of people encircling somebody and throwing things at them in order to kill them. And the only honest portion of this story is when you have Loki pointing out the absurdity of it and then causing, through Hodr, Balder's death. Which is also interesting, because in order to absolve the original persecutors, the original crowd, the editors of this myth decided to make only one of their number the bad guy. So essentially, they first scapegoated Balder, and then through time, it was Loki who became the scapegoat.
Everybody else couldn't possibly have been that cruel. Mm-hmm. It was Loki who did it.
And we know that myths were so violent and bloody, and that it made later generations uncomfortable, because Plato, the famous Greek philosopher, was one of those people who felt very uncomfortable with the violence of the poems. He called the myths poems, and he urged his fellow disciples to not pay those poems any heed. They're too violent. They're far too violent. So we know just from early accounts that later generations, you have a couple thousand years from the initial founding murder, you have, the descendants of these people who are very uncomfortable with the idea that their gods and heroes were really nothing more than persecutors and victims. So it's pretty interesting. And another example, one more example about that, we're not going to read you the story, but is one of the origin stories of Zeus being born from his Titan father. And as the story goes, Kronos was looking all over the world for the last of his children to devour. And you have a baby being ringed by armed men. and the baby's crying, and the armed men who were trying to protect him begin to beat their weapons against their shields to make enough noise that Kronos will not hear the crying of the baby. But what happens? The baby cries more and louder, so they get louder, and then the baby gets louder. This is really common when you have a myth where you have people encircling a baby or a single individual, that the myth makes out this crowd is to be somehow a type of bodyguard or protectors. But if you look at it from a distance and you don't read the writing, what you really have is a tableau of armed men surrounding a crying baby. So it really is a story of child sacrifice that has been edited and polished and whitewashed generations later. And on that note, we're going to switch gears a little bit, and we're going to look at what the Hebrew Bible has to say, also known as the Old Testament. Not about this, but we're going to look at a couple of stories from within it and see if we could recognize the same sort of mimetic crisis that we're seeing in these myths, just like we did last time. So I have one famous story from the Hebrew Bible to break apart, and it's the story of Jonah and the fish, right? Most people know this story, but we're going to read part of it in a moment here, just so that we could all have our memories refreshed. But basically, God tells Jonah to go forth and warn the people of Nineveh that their city is going to be destroyed if they don't repent of their ways. Jonah, hoping to evade this thankless task, runs away. He runs away and he embarks on the first ship sailing west to get as far away from Assyria as he possibly can. So we read in Jonah 1, chapter 1, verse 4, but the Lord sent out a great wind into the sea, and there was a mighty tempest in the sea, so that the ship was like to be broken. Then the mariners were afraid and cried every man to his God and cast forth the wares that were in the ship into the sea to lighten it of them. But Jonah was gone down into the sides of the ship, and he lay and was fast asleep. So the shipmaster came to him and said unto him, What meanest thou, O sleeper? Arise, call upon thy God, if so be that the God may think upon us, that we perish not. And they said every one to his fellow, Come and let us cast lots, that we may know for whose cause this evil is upon us. So they cast lots, and the lots fell upon Jonah. Okay, so let's break this part apart a little bit. The ship here represents the community, and the tempest, the sacrificial crisis. The jettisoned cargo is the cultural system that has abandoned its distinctions, and the fact that everybody calls out to his own God indicates a breakdown of religious order. Okay? The floundering ship can be compared to the city of Nineveh itself, threatened with destruction unless its people turn away from what they've been doing. So the forms may vary, but the crisis is always the same. And so the passengers, they cast lots to determine who is responsible for the crisis. In myths, chance is often always to be trusted to reveal the truth, and that goes the same with the Bible, for it reflects the will of the divinity. And the lot, in this case, designates Jonah, who proceeds to confess his culpability. What does he say in Jonah chapter 1, 10 through 12? Then the men were exceedingly afraid, and said unto him, Why hast thou done this? For the men knew that he fled from the presence of the Lord, because he had told them. Then they said unto him, What shall we do unto thee, that the sea may be calm unto us? For the sea wrought and was tempestuous. And he said unto them, Take me up and cast me forth into the sea, so that the sea shall be calm unto you. For I know that for my sake this great tempest is upon you. So then we have the sailors attempting to gain the shore by their own efforts. They would like to save Jonah's life, but they finally recognize the futility of their efforts and address themselves to the Lord, even though he is Jonah's Lord and not their own. And they say, Wherefore they cried unto the Lord and said, We beseech thee, O Lord, we beseech thee, let us not perish for this man's life, and lay not upon us innocent blood. For thou, O Lord, hast done as it pleased thee. So they took up Jonah and cast him forth into the sea, and the sea ceased from her raging. Then the men feared the Lord exceedingly, and offered a sacrifice unto the Lord, and made vows. What we see here is a reflection of sacrificial crisis and its resolution. The victim is chosen by lot, His expulsion saves his community, as represented by the ship's crew, and a new God is acknowledged through the crew's sacrifice to the Lord, whom they did not know before. Taken in isolation, the story tells us a little, but when seen against the backdrop of our whole discussion, each detail acquires significance. So that is the story of Jonah. We're not going to get into the whale, but it's an example of this sort of mimetic crisis in the Hebrew Bible.
So this is really interesting. Even in the Bible, which has a different feel to it, the behaviors of the people involved still reflect the same mimetic cycle, regardless of whether it's perceived as a myth or perceived as a truth, depending on how you stand on the Bible.
Correct. This theory that René Girard developed is based on universals. He's saying this is a universal manifestation of human behavior. This is collective violence, and this is how it always works. Now, again, remember what I said in the first episode. The prevailing ethic in America today is situational ethic, which basically doesn't acknowledge any universals. This is not that kind of ethic. This is an ethic based on absolutes.
Okay.
Believe it or not, accept the theory or discard it, that's up to you. But so far, no one's really come up with anything that makes this much sense.
Right.
Okay, so Jonah was basically an example of a reenactment of the mimetic crisis. I'm going to give you one more example from the Hebrew Bible, which I find very enlightening. And it's the story of Solomon's judgment, or you could call it the tale of two prostitutes, whatever you choose to call it. But I'm going to read you the story, and then we're going to break it down just like we did with Job. Then two prostitutes came to the king and stood before him. The one woman said, "O my lord, this woman and I have lived in the same house, and I gave birth to a child while she was in the house. Then on the third day after I gave birth, this woman also gave birth, and we were alone. There was no one else with us in the house. Only we two were in the house. And this woman's son died in the night because she lay on him. And she arose at midnight and took my son from me while your servant slept, and laid him at her breast, and laid her dead son at my breast. When I rose in the morning to nurse my child, behold, he was dead. But when I looked at him closely in the morning, behold, he was not the child that I had borne. But the other woman said, No, the living child is mine, and the dead child is yours. The first said, No, the dead child is yours, and the living child is mine. Thus they spoke before the king." So let's pause here a moment. What we're looking at is a mimetic crisis and rivalry of doubles. Remember, two people who are obsessed with the rival. Each sees the other is in their way. There's no distinction made in this part of Scripture between these two women, and they're both saying pretty much the same thing. The living child's mine, the dead child is yours. So there's very clear symmetry here, and that symmetry is at the heart of human conflict. So what does the king say? In verse 23, he says, the one says, "This is my son that is alive, and your son is dead." And the other says, "No, but your son is dead, and my son is the living one." And the king said, "Bring me a sword." So a sword was brought before the king. And the king said, "Divide the living child in two, and give half to the one and half to the other." So even here, the symmetry of the king's term corresponds completely with the equality between these two women. And then the woman whose son was alive said to the king, because her heart yearned for her son, "O my lord, give her the living child, and by no means put him to death." But the other said, "He shall be neither mine nor yours, divide him." So we have here the second woman revealing her lack of any genuine love for the child. The only thing that matters at this point to her is to possess what the other one possesses. The living child no longer counts. All that counts now is her fascination with the hated model and rival. In verse 27, then the king answered and said, "Give the living child to the first woman, and by no means put him to death. She is his mother." And all Israel heard of the judgment that the king had rendered, and they stood in awe of the king, because they perceived that the wisdom of God was in him to do justice. So Solomon, in this strategy to bring the real mother to the fore, recalls an important theme in the historical and prophetic books and in myth, and that is the theme of child sacrifice. Okay, we have to understand here that there is no way either woman knew how the king would react if one of them revoked their claim on this kid. They have no idea if he really meant it when he brought that sword. But you might think, oh, well, everyone knows Solomon was a wise king. Well, not at this point. He just became king and nobody knows anything about him. Nobody knows anything about him. And what we do know from the biblical text is that later kings had no problem with human sacrifice. King Manasseh saw the prophet Isaiah in half. Okay? There were other kings that were practicing human sacrifice all throughout the scriptures and other kings all throughout the Middle East at this time. Okay? So she had no idea if he meant it or not. So she is risking her own life by stepping forward and renouncing her desire for the child, because he could turn his anger against her. Like, what do you mean you don't want the kid anymore? You were lying this whole time. You could be put to death. So really, she's risking her own life in order that the child might go on living. She is agreeing to substitute herself for the sacrificial victim here. And really, if you're a Christian, this is probably the most perfect prefiguration of Christ you're going to see. In the Old Testament, as Christ's conduct parallels at every point with the conduct of the Good Mother. He agrees to die so that everyone else can live.
Well, with that very impressive parallel, we're going to go ahead and close this episode. Thank you for joining us for this. I hope you enjoyed it. Please stop in and listen to us again.
That's it, I think.
Punish me, Mother. I've been bad. So bad. Hey! Don't touch me. My leg hurts.
What's the matter, General? Mummy a little too much for you.
Never speak of my mother like that again, you little whore! Get over here.
What's going on here, General? No! That's it. Take your black tax and get out of my house. Touch her again, and I'll cut your balls off. Don't test me on this.
You! Filthy rat. I'm gonna kill you. Thief!
You ought to be nicer with the ladies.
You're gonna regret this.